Today, we are taking a closer look at Marsy's Law. We're talking to people on both sides of this controversial issue, and we want to hear from you as well. We have two very esteemed guests in studio today. Former Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Director Tom Hackney, thanks so much for being here. And we're also glad to welcome Jacksonville Criminal Defense Attorney Caleb Rowland. Thanks, Caleb.
Thank you.
Caleb, let's start, if we can, by explaining what Marsy's Law is. This was created as a way of balancing the rights of crime victims with those of the accused. Is that right?
Sure. So in 2018, the voters of the state of Florida approved an amendment to the Florida Constitution that basically laid out a list of rights that victims of crime in the state of Florida can enforce. A lot of these are procedural. A lot of them are notice-based. So you would be given notice when the defendant's first appearance is. You would be given notice when the sentencing hearing is. Some of them were also substantive as well. Things like being able to provide information to the court in terms of how that criminal activity has impacted you and your family. And then some of it was intended to protect crime victims' information from getting out to people that could potentially use it to harm those crime victims.
And so this was approved by voters in 2018 in Florida, and it's now the law in more than a dozen states around the country. Tom, this grew out of cases where victims felt like their rights weren't being respected. Either they weren't being informed maybe about the release of a criminal suspect, or perhaps, as Caleb said, their address or identifying information wasn't being kept secret from the perpetrators. It's particularly instances like a domestic violence situation. Is that right?
Yeah, as it came to be, and again, having dealt with crime victims over the years, it's one of the frustrations that the victims' families have is to how often they're exposed and almost re-victimized through some of that information getting out.
And you've obviously had a lot of experience working with crime victims and their families. And generally speaking, was this a law that in its initial formation and interpretation was something that you support?
Yes, without a doubt.
Mm-hmm. So in April 2021, a judge in a case that was brought by our local police union, the Fraternal Order of Police here in Jacksonville, they decided that Marsy's Law should have a broader application. So it wasn't just kind of the traditional crime victim that we might think of, but expanding Marsy's Law to protect the identity of some police officers in certain situations. Tom, tell us what you know about why the local Fraternal Order of Police had taken this case to court.
Well, the feeling is that when an officer becomes a victim, that protection extends to them as well. You don't, as a police officer, you certainly don't lose your rights because you're a police officer. And I think it's an interpretation that looks at the officers who are victims and puts them under that same umbrella of protection.
Mm-hmm. And so the understanding is that an officer, for instance, who's using force in a situation, particularly if it's lethal force, has him or herself been the victim of a crime in that circumstance. Can you kind of explain that interpretation?
So it's easy to forget that a police officer, first of all, is a person, is a human being employed in that capacity and does have rights of protection. But also when an officer extends the need to use lethal force in many, many cases, they are the victim of some crime perpetrated against them. So if somebody points a gun at them, they are a victim of an aggravated assault, or if they're shot at or shot, that turns them into victims.
And was that posture, that case that was taken up here by the police union, I would guess was sort of widely supported by local law enforcement?
Yes.
Yeah. And was there any controversy within that community that you knew of about whether that law had that, whether that was an appropriate application of the law?
I think as the group felt that it was a protection that was afforded by this legislation and an interpretation that, again, these police officers are victims and afforded that protection as well. So,
So Caleb, what has happened since that ruling in regards to police officers and transparency or whether their names, kind of how does that impact day-to-day cases involving law enforcement?
Well, one, you're not going to find out the identities of officers who could potentially be involved in, for lack of a better term, a cover-up. It's not hard for an officer at this point to say, I saw him point or attempt to use a weapon against me, and therefore I am a crime victim. Now, with the fact that we have body-worn camera, the fact that a lot of the vast majority, I think, of JSO squad cars have dash cams, that does help, and that does allow for some transparency there, with the problem that those may not be released if they have identifiable information in them. And you know, the concern here, I think, overall is what you alluded to, that there can be a lack of transparency in terms of the officer's actions and motives and things like that. And a lot of times, you know, in this wouldn't apply to, for example, internal affairs investigations, right? I can get all of this information.
Without a doubt.
You know, the state attorney's office is able to get all of the information. But at least in my experience, there does seem to be a greater level of protection, especially in cases involving shootings and potentially fatal shootings, where the officers, the law enforcement entity, because I don't want to say just JSO, the law enforcement entity can use this to kind of get themselves some breathing room to figure out, okay, how did this happen and what are we going to do about it?
I know that certainly just from my perspective as a reporter, that one of the direct impacts was the JSO's transparency site, which had all of the names of the officers involved in incidents of lethal force, that all of those names were scrubbed retroactively. So if someone had been involved, say, in multiple shootings or uses of force that were lethal, that was something that previously was known and no longer is known. Tom, what do you think about that fact? Do you think that that's appropriate in terms of trying to afford transparency to the community?
I think it's a byproduct of the affording of that law that could be looked at potentially as an unfortunate byproduct. But again, you know, the interpretation of the law allows that to happen, and I think until that law changes or some other legislative item comes down to change that, I think the sheriff's office here in Jacksonville and other police agencies will continue to use that right or protection afforded them.
Mm-hmm. We want to hear from you out there. We're having a good conversation about Marsy's law and how it is interpreted currently in regards to law enforcement officers. Give us a call at 549-2937. Tag us on X at FCC On Air. Email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org or message us on Facebook or Instagram. So this case is before the Florida Supreme Court. It's a decision that is expected before the end of the year. It doesn't involve directly our FOP. It's a case that's out of Tallahassee involving Tallahassee police officers and a use of lethal force. But that case was argued last year, and we're expecting now a decision before the end of this year. I think we have some arguments from this case that was argued before the Supreme Court. First, from the attorney who wants to end Marsy's law protections for police officers.
But I think a better interpretation of the term person in the context of this law is an individual. They were not acting as individuals. They were acting as agents of the government. They were in fact, the government on that day. When they went out there with their weapons, the power to arrest people, the power to detain people, the power to use deadly force against people if necessary, they weren't acting as persons in the way that law is, the way that word is defined here.
We also are going to hear now from the lawyer who's representing the Police Benevolent Association, who pushed back on that claim in his argument before the court.
My individual clients are people. They are police officers. In two separate incidents, both men were attacked, essentially unprovoked, with homicidal violence. Both of my clients responded with force. They both shot and they both killed their attackers. Each then affirmatively opted into the protections of Marsy's law.
Tom, I want to ask you what you think about that first argument that we heard. Is there a case to be made that an officer is not a person in the traditional sense of the word when they're performing their job as a law enforcement officer? Certainly, there is a difference between an officer who's engaging a suspect in a kind of crime scene situation versus just a hapless victim of crime.
I think it's an easy argument to make that, just like that attorney was doing, that they are not people, that they are agents of the government. However, having dealt with a few dead law enforcement officers who've been killed in the line of duty, they look like dead people to me. Having been involved in a shooting, I felt like a person. And I think it's easy to assign that, you're not a person as the outsider until you're involved in one of those incidents. You certainly feel like you're being victimized at that point in time. I can close my eyes right now and remember the 357 that was fired my way. I felt pretty much like a person that day. Lucky to go home. And again, I think the protections that are afforded by any law should apply to a police officer in the performance of their duty, just like it would to any other person out there.
So, Tom, you've worked at just about every level of homicide investigations, from patrol to detective, sergeant, lieutenant, chief, and then director of investigations, homicide investigations. How does that experience shape how you think about the role of officers and their interactions with the public?
Well, it's the lens in which I look through the world at. I can't shake 30 years law enforcement experience, nor would I want to. So that does impact how I look, just like Caleb's experience would impact how he looks at things. I do know that these officers are involved in these, are traumatized, they're victimized. There's not the first officer that I've met that set out to go out and shoot somebody the day that they did. So, it's something that you certainly want to give what rights are there to the officers wearing that badge.
Mm-hmm. Now, Caleb, in the case that's before the Supreme Court, the issue isn't the officers that are necessarily at risk of retaliation, in the sense of Marsy's law protecting their identity. They're actually invoking Marsy's law to protect them, in this case, from retaliation or blowback from the community. Isn't that kind of different than the original purpose, the original stated goal of the Victims' Bill of Rights and Marsy's law?
Absolutely. And, looking back over the history of how these laws in different states evolved, the idea was to keep people safe from essentially being re-victimized. Here, and what I think is, assuming that the Supreme Court does what I think they're going to do and affirming the First District Court of Appeal, what you're losing is public accountability.
And you say what the Supreme Court would do in terms of affirming that district court decision. You mean ruling on behalf of the police union?
Right. So, and this is super inside baseball, but essentially the Supreme Court isn't just going to review everything. It's not like a new trial or anything like that. What they're going to do is look at the reasoning that the First District Court of Appeal put into their opinion, determine if that comports with Florida law and with previous case law, and make a decision based on that. And the concern that I have is, and I completely agree with Tom in that these are individuals, people who are doing these jobs, but they are in fact government agents. They are in fact working on behalf of local government. And I have a visceral reaction to anything that would limit government oversight and government accountability. And I think that that's at least a real risk in applying the confidentiality laws to our law enforcement agencies.
What is the value in having that a name associated with an incident? I know that here there have been some officers that have been, and I think Tom can speak to this too. There's some officers that have been involved in multiple lethal uses of force. Obviously, that's not the majority, but is that information something that the community ought to know or ought to expect that they should know?
Absolutely. No question. The only way to make sure that your city, local, state, even federal government is doing what they're supposed to be doing is to know what they're doing. You have to be able to look at these situations and determine, was this appropriate or was it not? And when you don't know the identity of the people who were involved, well, now you have a problem because you don't know what their background was. You don't know if this has happened 3 times. You don't know if this has happened the first time. You don't know if that officer is 2 years into their career or they're 17 years into their career. And those are all things that have to go into the calculus that I think people need to go through, which is determining at a base level, was this a reasonable response?
Now, I think in my experience, JSO typically will say how long an officer has served and if an officer is involved in a use of force situation. But what do you think about that, Tom? I mean, is there some value in knowing, is there something that we learn if an officer has been involved in multiple fatal incidents over a period of time? Is there some knowledge that we gain about a particular incident if there have been many that have preceded it?
When information is put out to the public in reference to the officers who's been involved in a shooting, and even if a name isn't used, how long they've been with the agency and how many officer-involved shootings they've been involved with is typically, I can't say since I've left if that's every one of them, but I know that was certainly part of the narrative that I wanted to see go out to the public is, how many officer-involved incidents have they been in? How many lethal shootings have they had? And that's part of what goes out as well. I can appreciate Caleb and others' positions with wanting that transparency, but the assignment of a name at the front end, that I don't know how that's going to change anything at least from the official review of the case.
Although I would say, if you knew someone had been involved, say, in 4 lethal uses of force, police shootings, that being able to know what those other cases were would have value because you would want to know were the circumstances similar, was the defendant in any way, or the suspect, I should say, in any way similar. I mean, those conditions, those circumstances that happen in each case would seem to have some value for people interested in knowing if perhaps an officer is a problem officer.
It's from to talk Caleb's inside baseball, that those things are looked at both from the administrative review after the criminal review is taken the look at. And again, those don't happen in a vacuum. That's not just, at least here in Jacksonville, it's not just the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office looking at that. The State Attorney's Office does a complete but different and separate investigation into that. And if it's a lethal shooting, then the medical examiner is involved in that as well as a third eye, if you will, to look at that case and make a determination what occurred to the person who was shot, and they have an opportunity to weigh in and looked at with the State Attorney's Office in making a decision whether or not a shooting is ruled as justifiable or not. And then aside from that, from the administrative side, all those factors that we talked about are looked at.
I don't want to impugn anybody's reputation. Obviously, there's a lot of really good people in IA and internal affairs at the State Attorney's Office looking at these cases. But if I'm a member of the community and you're telling me that those are reviewed by police officers and another branch of law enforcement, basically the prosecutors, I don't know that that would satisfy me as a member of the public to say, like, that's enough of a objective review of somebody's actions.
Well, I certainly can appreciate that that opinion and that feeling and that position. I can tell you that at least here locally, that's what occurs, how it occurs, and if there's changes that need to be made, again, police officers just generally are not ones that make laws. We enforce them and follow them, and if there's some change that would need to be made from this case with Marsy's Law, with the Supreme Court decision, that's certainly what would be followed.
I want to talk a little bit about the environment in kind of the post-George Floyd era, because this case in Tallahassee has that element to it. It's not, again, that these officers are at risk of being re-victimized by the people that they killed. It's more that they're concerned about being outed for having been involved in what could be a controversial killing. Can you speak to that? I mean, I feel like that's a little bit of a different interpretation than just the officers are victims of aggravated assault if they're, if someone aims the gun at them and they fire in return.
Right. So one of the things that I look at with this situation is not just what are the legal requirements, but also, you have to look at what is going on in your community at the time that an event occurs. And I really think that with the fact that these are representatives of our government, and I think honestly, people tend to forget that these are an arm of our local and state and federal, depending on what entity you're working for. But our community is entitled to a certain amount of information to be able to make informed choices going down the road. And if we don't know that, an officer who's had 3 shootings in 6 years is involved in a use of force or use of force situation, you're impeding the ability of the people in that community to make informed decisions. And it may be that people don't care. That could be a possibility. But I'm always very hesitant to withhold information from the public on an issue that is important or should be important to the public.
Tom, what do you think about that somewhat broader application of this law when it comes to officers who are just concerned about not necessarily specific retaliation from a criminal assailant, but from the community? That's something that could apply in so many situations. I know that particularly after that summer of 2020, there was a lot of officers locally here who experienced what they felt was just kind of randomly targeted retaliation, who were, having people, flip them off as they drove down the highway or jump on their vehicles in some cases. So there was a lot of attention there. What would be the line to draw when it comes to, like, are you a victim? Do you deserve to be, your name kept secret? What would be if that could so broadly apply to so many officers in the community in a certain time, where would you draw the line about who must be out there in the public as an officer using their name versus somebody who could claim anonymity?
I think that the application as it goes, if it applies that you're a victim of a crime, and again, this is the current interpretation that's being looked at. If you are a victim of a crime, I think to use that protection afforded to you, it's not just the person that you shot that is, I won't say a threat, but a potential threat. There are family members, and those things do get fairly heated. I can personally say that, it's odd. There's always a piece in the back of my mind with all those cases that I've had something to do with, in helping get people to life in prison and on death row and being an active part of that. Over my shoulder, I think, is there somebody that's a family member of those people who are nonetheless happy with what happened in their loved ones' cases, that they would want to extract some revenge? And here I am showing my, well, not my face today, but I'm out and about, and I was like, hey, that's that guy that that had something to do with my loved one. So that kind of sits in the back of your mind. Again, puts you back to being a person that these things happen with. Although a person who is a government agent is still a person who has a wife and children and a family, who you have to have those thoughts in your head as to protecting them as well.
It's interesting because you obviously have been, when you were with the agency, the face of so many cases. I think many people will remember you, during the Lonzie Barton case, speaking to the public, holding one of his stuffed animals, appealing for people to be watchful and try to help police officers find that child. So you are, almost the opposite of that. I mean, you really have been very public in terms of your law enforcement career. But do you think, though, that officers are increasingly reluctant to, like, for instance, have their names on their police vehicles, or just be, even in a crime report that may not be a fatal situation, reluctant to have their names on those reports?
I think so. I think that is a potential, that is a pendulum swinging maybe a little too far with concern for that. With the removing of the cars, it's such a fine line and such a level of balance that you have to have between transparency and protecting those people doing the job, some protection that is, again, legally afforded them. It's sometimes a tough line to walk.
Caleb, you'd said your expectations of the outcome of this is a very conservative Supreme Court that we have right now. Do you think that they're going to be guided by ideology, or do you think that this bill itself is just problematic and perhaps not very well crafted?
That's a very good question. To be honest, I think that all of our courts try to do the best job that they can. I don't think that there's anyone out there who's necessarily openly pushing an agenda. I do think that given the posture of the case and just the way that the appellate courts work, there is a much higher likelihood that the Florida Supreme Court will affirm the First District Court.
For those of us who don't know, like, when you say how the appellate court works, kind of explain just briefly, if you can, what it is that the Supreme Court has before them.
Sure. So what they're looking at is questions of law. They're not there to make determinations on facts. They're not there to reweigh evidence. Their job is to look at the analysis that the First District Court of Appeal engaged in coming to their opinion, and determine does that comport with Florida law and with our case law. Now, on there's different kind of levels of review, or different, the way that I explain to people who aren't in legal field is different lenses that a court would look at an issue through.
So just a quick note, we did reach out to JSO last week about this topic, and did not hear back. We also invited the local Fraternal Order of Police to participate in this discussion, but they declined, citing this pending Supreme Court decision. So one recent development that I think is interesting is that the Marsy's Law of Florida group, which is basically the group that advocated for and pushed this Florida bill through as a citizen amendment, is now saying that police names should not be protected under the law. They're saying that that was not the original intent. Tom, do you think that that position by Marsy's Law of Florida would have any bearing on the position of law enforcement officers, considering that the group that passed the law doesn't currently support the way it's being used?
Yeah, I think there's a respect for their opinion, and I think that overall, that, again, I really truly feel like that the position that law enforcement, not just local but just in general, takes with this is something that fits under that umbrella, that because it fits there, we're going to allow ourselves that protection that's afforded by it. If that protection gets removed, then you draw back and punt. You come back with something different, and you remove that and put the transparency site back up. However, the fact that the group that pushed for this maybe doesn't feel that exact same way, I think there's a respect for them, because as respect for crime victims and how that impacts it, you want to have respect for that group, certainly. But I think that when you look at law enforcement as people doing the government's agent's job, not just government agents, that kind of makes you want to lean towards that.
Just a couple quick messages we got. Tom on Facebook saying accountability is important. The public has a right to know if there's a pattern of abuse of authority, especially in cases of lethal force. And Duke reaching out to us on X, wondering if JSO investigates its own officer shootings versus FDLE. In fact, JSO does investigate its own. Other law enforcement agencies usually farm that out, but JSO does it internally. We just want to touch very briefly, because we're kind of closing in, but how does this impact JSO's ability to solve crimes? It's not just officers whose names are shielded, it's victims' names. And therefore, you're not allowed to go out and say, we're looking for somebody who perhaps saw, John Smith on the street today earlier. How does that impair your ability to solve crimes?
It does tie your hands a little bit when it comes to what information you're able to share about your crime victims. And sometimes that information about the crime victims can be what helps you get that information. When before the Marsy's law, I, having been that talking head that gets up there and talks about these, certainly the humanizing of the victims and putting their stories out, it can be enough sometimes to tug on folks' heartstrings to make that call. And again, it's that one little piece of information that investigators need or want, and using the victim's information and their story to get out there can be important.
Well, I would like to thank our guests, former JSO Director Tom Hackney and criminal defense attorney Caleb Rowland. Thank you both so much for being here and talking about this important issue. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.